Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, well, I've been a member of this church for 11 years. It's been an incredible blessing. This place has really been a family to me. I met my wife, Jo, here. If you're an international student in the room, I came here for 6 months, met an English girl, wound up here a lot longer than I thought. So do be careful if you're an international student. When I was asked to speak by Charlie on Student Sunday, I thought, let me think back to what my perception of Christianity was when I showed up at university. And to me, Christianity was a bunch of outdated rules. Sort of like some of the crazy old laws that are still on English law books. I did a bit of research into that in preparation for this sermon, and here are a couple of examples. In Chester, it's illegal for any Welshman to enter before sunrise or after sunset. If he does, you can shoot him with a bow and arrow. Good to know. Under the Metropolitan Police Act of 1839, it's illegal to be drunk in a pub, club, or any licensed premises. Any criminals in the room? No honest ones, anyway. It's also illegal to drive a cow when drunk. So some of you might be thinking, it'd be worth getting thrown in jail just to have that story. Or my personal favorite, it's legal, it's okay for a man to urinate in public as long as it is on the rear wheel of his motor vehicle and his right hand is on the vehicle. Hey, it's your country. Some of us and some of our friends probably think of Christianity a bit like this: a load of weird, out-of-date, sexually repressive, impossible to follow rules made by people who obviously never went to university. I can remember when I was an undergrad, one guy was trying to share his faith with others, and he said, I used to party, I used to drink, I used to have sex, but then I became a Christian, and now I don't do any of those things anymore. And I thought, yeah, great, where can I sign up? Okay, this is how I used to perceive Christianity, ridiculous rules that I thought were much more fun to break than to follow. It wasn't until I was 19 that I began to take questions of faith seriously for the first time, and as I looked deeper, what I found was that the meaning of Christianity was completely different than what I thought it was. And I can remember thinking to myself, distinctly remember thinking to myself, if I had known what this was really about, I would have signed up ages ago. Why didn't anyone tell me? What I found was that Christianity isn't about rules, it's about relationships. And there's one story that Jesus told which especially helped me to see this. It's from the Gospel of Luke in chapter 15, and it goes like this. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. The younger son broke every rule. He demanded his inheritance early, which in that culture was basically to wish his father dead. He abandoned his family. He wasted what his father had worked his whole life to provide on wild living. And yet, at the mere sight of him, the father takes off running to embrace his son and to welcome him home. Man, if only my parents responded like that when I broke the rules as a teenager. I remember this one time, I'm not even sure which rule I broke, but it must have been a big one because my mom and dad absolutely lost it. Dad chased me out onto the front lawn, hitting me with his shoe. It's not funny. My mom, being a bit of a gentler spirit, she grabbed a bag of Doritos from the cabinet and she ran after me. She slammed this bag of Doritos over my head and these orange crisps went flying everywhere. I think Grandma actually picked up the fire poker, but thankfully her bad hip slowed her down. One of our neighbors even called the cops when he saw me getting attacked by shoes and Doritos and Grandma. It's definitely one of our low points as a family. I wonder what the younger son in this story thought when he saw his father sprinting towards him from afar. He probably thought it was more likely for him that he was going to get hit with something than that he was going to be embraced and kissed and welcomed home. In fact, he would have been fully aware that there was a specific Jewish ceremony for those who lost their inheritance to non-Jews and then tried to come home. And in that ceremony, the whole village would have gathered around him and shouted, "He is cut off from his people." Instead, he is embraced and kissed. I'm sure his father wasn't pleased about the rules that he had broken, but the father's love for his son, his desire for relationship, completely overshadowed any concern he had about broken rules. The father ran to his son. It's likely the father would have been wearing a long, flowing robe, and to run to his son, he would have had to hike up the robe in his hands and expose his legs as he ran, something that would have been considered extremely shameful in his culture. But he couldn't care less what anyone else thought. His boy had come home. The son had prepared a longer speech in this passage, and he was going to ask his father for a job. It was still actually, even at this point, it was still about what he could get from his father, what his father could do for him. But when he sees the extravagance of his father's love for him, he cuts his speech short and finally knows that there's only one thing to say. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. But before he could even get the words out of his mouth, his father grabs him and squeezes him tight and welcomes him home. The father doesn't ask the son if he's ready to follow the rules. He doesn't put him to work and say, we'll talk in a few weeks. He doesn't say, have a shower and clean yourself up first, and then we'll chat. He embraces him just as he is. And then to show his son just how committed he is to having him home again, he kills the fattened calf, his best animal, and throws a huge party. The story goes on to say that when the older brother came back from working in the fields and saw his younger brother and heard the music and dancing, he became angry and refused to go in. He said, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and have never disobeyed your orders. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him. The older brother thinks it should be about the rules. I've kept the rules. He hasn't. Only those who keep the rules are worth celebrating. And I think there's some older brother in all of us, because that's what we've been taught, that we're only worthy of love to the extent that we've followed the rules. Perhaps we didn't always think this. One of my most vivid memories from childhood is of my dad coming home from work nearly every day, at least it felt that way, with some sort of small toy from F.A.O. Schwartz, the famous toy store in New York City. And I don't remember at that point feeling like I had to do anything special to get a toy. I was my dad's son. Okay, that was enough. But then I can remember this picture beginning to shift. I can remember when I got a bit older, one of my uncles sat me and my brother down, and he told us that the reason that we got gifts was because we were good. because we followed the rules, and that we would only continue to get gifts if we continued to follow the rules. And slowly, I think I began to see my worth not as the intrinsic worth of a child, but more like the worth of an employee who's only worth keeping around if he continues to perform well. It was no longer enough to just be a son. Now I needed to be a successful son, too. Now I needed to win. And if other people had to lose in the process, well, so be it. In a place like Oxford, everywhere you turn, you're going to be asked to believe this. Here are the rules you need to follow to be worthy in the eyes of Oxford University. For the size of that, I'm sure Oxford Brookes has something similarly large. I've always wanted to do that. And those are just the official rules. There are just as many unwritten rules. Rules that promise people will love you if you put the ball in the back of the net every match. If you look the way they think you should look. People will love you as long as you drink as much as they say you should drink. As long as you have sex as much as they think you should. Not so much that you get a reputation, but not too little that you are seen as a prude. People will love you as long as you're on track to make a lot of money, as long as you hang out with the right sort of people who went to the right sort of schools and have the right sort of accents. And the temptation will be to start to believe it. And all of a sudden, we start evaluating other people in these ways as well. We start saying things like, she doesn't deserve him, or he's not good enough for her, or she's out of his league. We start to value people based on what they deserve, based on how well they've followed the rules. Early on in our dating relationship, my wife Jo was a bit blinded by love, and she said to me at one point, "Vince, I don't deserve you." To be honest, I think she was fishing for a few compliments. And I responded, "No, you don't." And thankfully for my sake, I continued. And I said, "And I don't deserve you either. Isn't it wonderful? How could we ever deserve another person as our very own? Surely that's a gift that's beyond what any one of us could deserve." The best relationships are not about whether or not we deserve each other. Where's the freedom in that? Always worried about whether you'll mess up or get fat or get old and no longer deserve the person that you love most. And what a nightmare. We all have some older brother in us, even with respect to ourselves. We think we're only worthy of love to the extent that we followed the rules, or to the extent that we've been impressive, successful, or beautiful. Christianity says otherwise. Christianity says the best forms of love are not about deserving. They're not about what we earn or merit or accomplish. They are simply about being a child. And the question, why do you love your child, doesn't even make sense to a parent standing over a newborn baby. What do you mean, why do I love my child? I made her. She's in my image. She has my nose. The younger son broke every rule, but he was a son. He was family, and that was more than enough. Jesus told that story as a picture of God's love for us. Love that is unconditional. Love that cannot be earned by following the rules like the older brother. Love that cannot be lost by breaking the rules like the younger brother. And so as a Christian, you can stop competing to be loved, and you can just enjoy it. If I had to summarize my experience of the Christian life in one line, that might be it. You can stop competing to be loved and start enjoying it. Which is not to say that there are no rules in Christianity. Even in the passage for today, we see that the older brother says he never disobeyed his father's orders. There are rules. But rules in the context of relationship don't have to be a bad thing. One rule that Joe and I decided we would follow, and that many Christians follow, is not to have sex before we were married. And this is one of those Christian practices, depending on your background, that might seem downright weird. The extent of my sex education growing up was don't get anyone pregnant, and so this was very new to me when I became a Christian. And I can remember sitting down with my best friends and telling them that I had decided I wasn't going to have sex again until I got married, and they looked at me like I had 3 heads. Then when Joe and I were about to get married, one of our friends came to give us a wedding card a few days early because she couldn't make it to the wedding. And so she gave us the card, and we opened it, and we started to read the card in front of her, and then we just started laughing hysterically. And she was like, "Why are you laughing at my lovely card?" And then we turned it around to show her, and at the end, when she was signing off, she meant to write, "Wishing you all the best," but she must have been thinking about how weird it was that we hadn't had sex yet, and so she wrote, without knowing it, "Wishing you all the sex." Jen. It's definitely our favorite wedding card. So not having sex before marriage can seem pretty weird. Let me try to make a little sense out of it. The way we use words is important. Even slight errors with our words can have significant consequences. Another time, Joe had bought a bicycle, and it was a really heavy bicycle. And whenever she would get on the bike and sort of go down the street, she would sort of wobble down the street initially before it straightened out. And she said to me, "Vince, when I ride this bike, why do I always wobble?" And I said, "Oh, that's because you have such a heavy frame." And then there's just this long pause and this look of death, and finally, I'm so slow. If I said, the bike has a heavy frame. Okay, minor error of words, major difference. Okay, words are powerful. When I look back at the worst moments in my life, it's not fist fights, it's not times I've been punched or hit with things. It's not even times I've failed miserably. It's words. It's the times I was lied to, or the times when people said one thing to my face and then something very different behind my back. It's the times when the words that were spoken did not reflect what someone actually meant. Why do Christians make a big deal about sex? It's not just because of some arbitrary, outdated rule. It's because sex is a type of word, a symbolic word, a physical word. Sexual intercourse is actually a very appropriate name because sex says something. Causing another to be fulfilled sexually is the strongest word in our physical language. It's the word that says all of me for all of you, always. God wanted me and Joe to wait because when we did use that word, he wanted us to know that it really meant what it felt like it meant. All of me for all of you, always. God wanted me and Joe to be able to trust that when we said something to each other, whether verbally or physically, it was the truth. And he wanted Joe to know that being careful with her heart was more important than rushing to fulfill my own desires. Now, I know there's a lot more to say on that topic, but I just bring it up because that's one example in my life where I've experienced that God's rules, even if they seem weird at first, they're not outdated. They're not an attempt to spoil our fun. And they're not some arbitrary test to get him to love us. They're a gift because he already loves us, and he wants the best for us. In fact, I can say without any doubt that following Jesus has led to the most honest and the most life-giving relationships I have ever known. Before I was a Christian, the idea of waiting for marriage for sex would have seemed unthinkable. Not only because it would have seemed weird, but because there's no way I would have had the strength to do it. I had never dated a girl that I hadn't cheated on. Each time I would tell myself that that was the last time, but I was always too weak to actually be the person that I knew deep down I was supposed to be. I betrayed some of my closest friends in ways that would make any one of you disgusted, and I very nearly destroyed some of those relationships as a result. Without God in my life, I have no doubt that I would be an unfaithful husband headed for a destroyed marriage. My Christian life has looked so very different. Not because of me. Please hear me say that. But because becoming a Christian is not just a matter of believing something different. It's a matter of God's Spirit literally coming to live inside of you and giving you the strength to live out the life that you were made for. Do you know that life? Faithfulness where there was unfaithfulness. Confidence where there was insecurity. Peace where there was anxiety. Patience where there was anger. Joy where there was sadness. Have you experienced this? Jesus didn't say that I've come just so that people could believe some new things. He said, I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. The Bible says that the fruits of God's Spirit in your life will be love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and generosity and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. Do you know this life? A life of true freedom. Not the freedom to do anything and everything regardless of the consequences, but the freedom to be the person that you need to be for the people that you love most. When I now read the story that Jesus told of a father and his two sons, it's easy for me to relate to the younger son. Because by any standard, some of the sin in my life was bad. And it was obvious that what I needed was forgiveness. But it's amazing to me that for years, I simply refused to see my need for forgiveness. I think I was scared of forgiveness. Because forgiveness meant that I needed to be forgiven, which meant that I was wrong, which meant that I was bad, which meant that I wasn't worthy of love. I could always look around and find some neighbor down the street or some criminal on the news who had done something worse than me. And I'd think to myself, I don't have a problem with sin. That guy has a problem with sin. There was a boy named Ewan that I used to fight with as a teenager. He wasn't a very nice kid, neither was I. And I took every opportunity I could to put him down. A few years ago, I heard that Ewan had killed himself. The Bible says that the wages of sin is death. And never were those words so real to me as when I heard that news. Would Ewan have killed himself if I had been kind to him? If I had offered my hand to him? I don't know. Sometimes when I try to explain sin to people, they want to tell me that I'm exaggerating. That really I'm not so bad. It's not like I've killed anyone. Actually, that's not a very easy question for me to answer. And what if God shone his light not just on Ewan, but on the rippling effects of all of my unkind words over the years? Our perspective is often so limited. What if we were able to trace the consequences of the things that we've done wrong over many years? What if we compare what's in our hearts not to some guy down the street or someone we see on the news, but to the heart of God? From God's perspective, every one of us would look quite a lot like the younger son. By the end of the story, the younger son was right about one thing, and the most important thing. There was a cost to the things he had done wrong, and he knew it should have been him who paid that cost. But who paid the cost for the son's sin? The father did. He gave up his wealth to give his son his inheritance early. And remember, back then, it wasn't like he could just go by a bank and take out the money to give to his son. His wealth would have been his land and his animals, and they would have had to have been sold in order to give his son what he asked for. The father's land also would have determined his standing in society. So the son not only cost the father his wealth, but also his status in the community. Then when he sees his son off in the distance, he hikes up his robe and he takes off running embarrassingly with his legs exposed. He gives up his dignity. He averts all eyes off of the shame of his son and onto his own shame. And then he gives everything else. The best robe, which would have been the father's own finest robe, a ring, probably a signet ring, which meant he was trusting the son with the authority to act on behalf of the family. Sandals, because the son probably showed up barefoot as a slave would. But free men wear sandals, and the son was now free. And then finally, the cost is fully paid with the death of the fattened calf. Not a sheep or a goat, but a calf, which normally would have been reserved for only royal guests. At every point, it was the loving father who paid the price on behalf of his son. And this story is a story about each one of us. We've done things wrong. Okay, we've taken the life that God has given us, and we've gone our own way with it. And like the younger son, I think we know deep down that we ought to be the ones to pay for it, to pay the cost. Instead, God pays. It cost him the riches of heaven as he came to live a human life with no material wealth. It cost him his status, the king of the whole universe, coming down to be born among animals in a barn. It cost him his dignity as he was publicly mocked and spat on and forced to hang naked on a cross. And then the ultimate cost was death. Not just the death of the best animal, but his own death. At every point, God paid the price of welcoming us home, because that is what a perfect parent does for a son and a daughter. And so today, I think you have a choice to make. Are you going to be a slave, or are you going to be a son? Are you going to be a slave, or are you going to be a daughter? For some of you, as you start university, the reality is that this is the week in which you will make the most important decision of your time here in Oxford. This is the week in which you'll nail your colors to the mast. Are you going to be a slave, or are you going to be a child of God? You can be a slave in a lot of different ways. You can be a slave to sex, to popularity, to grades, to money, to success. You can even be a slave to religion, never disobeying the Father's orders, but still not understanding his love for you and your status as a child of God. You can be a slave in many ways, but there's only one way to be a son or daughter. Father, I have sinned. You become a son or a daughter by responding to the Father's love with simple but sincere, heartfelt words. I'm sorry. Thank you. I'm sorry for the things I've done wrong. I'm sorry for the ways I've turned my back on you. I'm thankful that you didn't give up on me. Thank you for being willing to pay the full cost of welcoming me home. Some of you today may feel like you're far from God. But remember that it was when the younger son was still far off that his father ran to him, arms outstretched, and embraced him and kissed him and brought him into a new way of life. Maybe this is your first time in church and you've never told God that you want him in your life. Maybe you've been in church every Sunday for years, but if you're honest with yourself, your life has looked more like the life of a slave than it has like the life of a son. Maybe you've been chasing after things that are not from God. Maybe you've bought into the lie that following the rules, even God's rules, is what will make you worthy of love. If today you want to say to God that you don't want to be a slave to whatever it is that has enslaved you in the past, to whatever it is that's threatening to enslave you today, and that instead you want to be his son or his daughter, you want to know his love, and you want to know the strength that comes from being a child of God, then I'm just going to lead us in a prayer that makes that commitment to God. Some of you may be saying this to God for the first time. Some of you may have said this to God in the past, but you know in your heart today that you need to make a recommitment to him. It's just going to be a simple prayer that says, I'm sorry, and says, thank you, and that says, in the years ahead, I don't want to be a slave, but by your strength, I want to be your son or your daughter. Why don't we just bow our heads together and close our eyes? And if this morning that's the desire of your heart, to be a son or daughter of God, whether you're saying that to God for the first time, or whether you said that to him before, but you know that this morning you need to recommit yourself to him, I'm just going to ask you to just raise your hand where you are. Everyone just keep their heads bowed. Thank you. Thank you. There's nothing magical about raising a hand, but it's just a symbolic way of saying to God that I'm ready to trust you. And in the years ahead, I want to live by your side and know your love and live as your child. Thank you. Feel free to just pray with me. God, I thank you. Thank you for showing us what true love is. And the love that takes off running like an embarrassing fool after your children. Lord, thank you for loving me, for loving each person in this room. I know today that that love is an undeserved gift. I know I've done wrong. I know I've strayed from you. I'm deeply sorry, and I ask for your forgiveness. Thank you, Jesus, for giving your life for me so that I can be fully forgiven. Thank you for taking the full cost. Thank you for dying in my place. And thank you for offering true life, the fullness of life. God, I accept that life. I don't want to be a slave to whatever has enslaved me in the past. I choose to be your son. I choose to be your daughter. And I trust you with all of these things in Jesus' name. Amen.